Welcome to this panel in 18th century music, sorry, 17th and 18th century music. I'm sure it will be very enlightening. First, we have Dr. Anna Stefanovic.
Yes.
She's professor in musicology at the University of Arts in Belgrade, and she will reflect about the topos of transcendence in the music drama from Monteverdi to Rameau. Anna, you have the word.
Thank you very much. So after listening about the topos of mechanicity or mechanical topos, I'll speak about one other universal topos. It might be said of European musical history from Middle Ages to today, but about its, I think, foundation for the modern music history in 17th century and particularly in the genre of music drama. So the first birth of tragedy from the spirit of music in the Greek tragedy, as Nietzsche would say, and the other birth of music from the spirit of tragedy at the advent of the modern age at the beginning of the 17th century, giving rise to the formation of the new genre, la drama per musica, testify to the substantial union of tragedy and music. Their deep link lies in catharsis, one of the two constituent elements of tragedy, the second one being anagnorisis, both linked to the emotions of pity and fear, as Aristotle said. The musical modus operandi of catharsis have been specified in Aristotle's Politics, quote, "For feelings such as pity and fear, or again enthusiasm, exist very strongly in some souls and have more or less influence over all. Some persons fall into a religious frenzy, whom we see as a result of the sacred melodies, when they have used the melodies that excite the soul to mystic frenzy, restored as though they had found healing and purgation." Then music operates the catharsis, the purgation, the healing, in such a way that it operates transcendence in catharsis, and this in two ways: as the overcoming of the states of upheaval, of the excitement of the soul, by using sacred melodies, and also by evoking through them transcendent instances themselves. These are poetry and music that invoke transcendent presences in prayer, lamentation, incantation, hymn, in song with the sacred function, in the appeals addressed to the other and to the infinite. This is why the dramatic progression of Greek tragedy and Baroque tragedy in music shows itself as a movement towards the sacred, testifying to a tragic theology, to a tragic religiosity, according to Gerhard Nebel, leading in the history and in the history of interpretations of tragedy to a confusion of Christian faith and Greek tragic religiosity. This was a topic of wide interpretation, but I cannot elaborate all them now. This journey is marked by a trust of the hero, of the tragic hero, towards salvation, towards deliverance, towards catharsis, as the exit from frightening and pitiful actions, and as the transcendence of the tragic outcome. Hence also the non-tragic end of many tragedies, and most of the musical tragedies, leading, quote, towards a holy death in a sacred landscape on the outskirts of a sacred city, as a return to the feast, to the glorious solemnity, and quote by Paul Ricoeur, his essay on tragedy. And I would add the Grand Ballet, il balletto, at the end of La Drama per Musica, testifies about this solemn end. Therefore, the trajectory of tragedy imposes itself as a trajectory from pain to light, from terror to calm, from the distentio to the intentionem, St. Thomas Aquinas, from time to eternity, from suffering to knowledge, and the tragic knowledge, as Jaspers would say, from the tragedy suffered to the tragedy overcome, Ricoeur once again. This is why in the music drama, the topos of transcendence appears as a rule, as the final link in its narrative chain. In our previous research, we proposed a narrative configuration of tragedy in music by taking inspiration from the triple mimesis of Paul Ricoeur from his study Toleracy, a configuration made up of 3 links concerning the different levels of action, reflecting the connection between mimetic and temporal characters. So mimesis 1, unfigured or prefigured time, mimesis 2, configured time, and mimesis 3, refigured time. And you have these 3 mimesis in several levels of, let's say, musical signification and expression. We have observed that this narrative sequence constitutes the fundamental narrative frame, reflecting the causality and the directionality of the action specific for music drama. Temporal and mimetic characters, then subject to a semiotization of music dramatic time, impose themselves as distinct expressive genres, the term by Robert Hutton, but used here somewhat modified and adapted to music dramatic genre, of which the music drama in its misto genere is composed from its creation. So the expressive genres of drama equivalent the non-figured time of conflict and action, of pastoral configured time of narration and fiction, and tragedy refiguring reality and dramatic conflict by the mediation of pastoral narrative and fiction. The 2 links of drama and pastoral flow therefore into the third, the expressive genre of tragedy. If the relationship between the pastoral and the drama is revealed as an opposition, as pastoral concordance, consonance versus dramatic discordance and dissonance, the tragic outcome of the narrative sequence then represents the dialectical crossing of the 2 previous terms. After the pastoral, it comes as a contrast, as a rupture after the apparently reached stability of the eternal mythical present. On the affective level, it manifests itself as a concentration of the tragic, aroused by emotions of Aristotelian fear and pity. On the dramaturgic level, it acts as a metabola, transporting the soul of the hero outside of itself, himself, as Aristotle says. It is frequently the topoi of madness, of extreme pain, of this disintegration of the self, of suffering that sustain this experience of the tragic. But after this moment, the hero suddenly regains his composure, quote, as if he had taken a remedy from Aristotle's Politics. Then he is no longer transported outside of himself, but is taken out of the self as out of the same, of the tautological tragic situation in which he was like frozen until then, and opens up to the other and to the infinite. He recognizes that as an ethical movement, catharsis turns out to be essentially transcendent as a surpassing oneself. The place of the topos of transcendence belongs on the musical dramatic level to the great tragic monologue, representing at the same time the strongest link of the music drama with its dramatic model of antiquity. It is itself, so the tragic expressive genre, made up of 2 topoi, 2 contrasting but causally related steps, reflecting 2 stages described by Aristotle. After the tension and agitation of the tragic subject, faced with death or loss of the loved being or of love itself, appears the contrast where the fatal outcome is overcome and reassessed on another level. The topoi of death, of loss in general, and of transcendence carry then the tragic expressive genre, representing at the same time a dialectical junction of the archetypal models of the 2 preceding links in the narrative chain, drama and pastoral, of their rhetorical impulses and their expressive musical forms. We shall first examine here the final monologue of the Messaggera in Act 2 of Orpheus by Monteverdi, at the very beginning of the drama per Musica. The temporal and narrative chain is in this Act 2 of Orpheus, initiated by the dramatic tension and the recitative style of the situation where the messaggera announces to Orpheus the tragic news of the death of his beloved, followed by the exclamation of Orpheus, alas. The dramatic and musical course is continued then by the passage in the domain of the narrated time, by the transition in the past verbal tense, which supports the explicit narration. Therefore, the still and narrative of the messaggera recount the fatal event which took place in the pastoral environment. So this is the passage into the pastoral expressive genre. Quote, in a flowery field with her other companions, she wandered, bending over flowers to make a garland for her hair, when a treacherous snake crouched in the grass, etc. Although she recounts an unfortunate event, the very act of telling the story represents a fictional distancing from the action, and therefore a relaxation, a respite, the concordance and the consonance found in the flow of the narrative. The end of the messaggera's monologue represents the entry into the tragic genres, where she first faces the pain she brought to, no, this is not one. Yes, back. No, that's right. The pain she brought to Orpheus, and then decides to withdraw from the world forever. But, quote, but I, whose language brought the knife, who pierced the loving heart of Orpheus, where can I hide? For I am loathsome to shepherds and nymphs, and even to myself, a helpless creature of the night. I will forever flee the sun and into a lonely cave, live a life that suits my sorrow. This is the place where the topos of transcendence acts. In fact, this duality of meaning and of two topoi, of loss and pain on the one hand, and of transcendence on the other, leads to clear division of that final part of the monologue, accompanied by the crossing of the expressive means of two previous genres. The recitative and the recitativo narrativo suppose the initial stanzas of the monologue written in the past tense, referring to the previous narrative recounting the tragic event, even to the spoken words and to the language, questa lingua itself. But the transition into the present, odiosa dove m'ascondo, marks the moment of rapture and awakening, opening at the verbal level the way to the future time, but indeed to eternity, fuggirò sempre. This is why generally descending espressivo and the plaintive melody in the vocal part on the words which pointed to the responsibility recognized by the messaggera, but me whose language brought the knife, etc., could be followed in the Monteverdi's music by the ascent of the melody on the words mio dolor conforme at the very end of the monologue. This very end of the scene shows a rhetoric and hermeneutic gesture by Monteverdi, his trope, and Robert Hutton would say, but also his metaphor view regarding the music-text relation. Music creating a new semantic pertinence by splitting the reference, by attributing an impertinent predicate to the literal reference. An unusual anti-madrigalesque gesture activating the rise of the melody and anabasis on the words mio dolor, my pain, in a mixolydian mode with a major tetrachord within it, is counterbalanced, however, by a figure of lament descending Phrygian tetrachord in an Aeolian mode in the partal continuum. So two contradictory gestures at the same time. This dual gesture represents superimposed the pain and its transcendence, the negation and the affirmation, to refer to Tarasti, the two stages as two tenses, the past and the future, being overcome, refigured into a new existential subject, recognizing the infinite. checked yet. Oh, it works, you see?
Yeah, we can.
Why? Is there a problem you can see?
Maybe it's this correct, it seems like.
Cum formato vizual si fa kad se ubacila?
Radio je juče sam probala. Ne znam koji je format, ali juče radio ovdje.
Ako bi M3 sigurno neće. Morao bi da...
Ali radio je juče. Ja sam juče probala. Da.
Na ovom mislim.
Ne, nisam. U drugu sam. Will it work now?
It should.
Example from French tragedy en musique, in the fourth act of Lillet's opera Roland on Ariosto's famous epic, the triple narrative chain begins with the strong dramatic impulse coming from Roland's suspicion that his beloved Angélique has left with Médor, becoming the source of the hero's inner conflict. The drama supporting this conflict is followed then by the entry on the troop of shepherds and shepherdesses, so the pastoral genre changing into an extended pastoral configuration in the mythical landscape of a village wedding. It is inside this pastoral landscape that Roland comes to know that the story told him by the shepherds that his beloved left with his rival and who then causes sudden passage into the tragic genre. Thus opened up, the narrative sequence of the expressive genre of tragedy is made up of two steps, again, represented this time by two monologues by the hero. The narrative sequence of the tragic expressive genre is formed, in this case, of the hero's inner conflict, the topos of Roland's madness as a consequence of loss and death, his repentance, and finally, immediately after the final fall, quote, "Go and hide from yourself if you can," in eternal darkness, of the transcendence of this conflict state with the help of an invisible force, this time by the transcendent essence itself, personified by the fairy Logistie and the chorus of shadows. Roland, what assistance has come to save me from my fatal passion? Chorus, today cast forth forever the shameful bonds of love. The topos of loss and death you can see it here, the madness of Bono is assured by the matrix of tools of dramatic topos in the form of a recitative sample in the flow of the action, which is metrically changing, oscillatory, interrupted by rest with frequent tonal changes, temporally discontinued and non-figured flow. It is carried by figure characteristic of these topos, primarily by figures of exclamatio and interrogatio, as well as the ones from the group of hypotyposes. However, this spectrum of means is placed on the figure of lament. The second one, please. On the figure of lament, a descending Phrygian tetrachord is continual, which in itself signifies the incorporation of the mimesis of action into the tragic expressive genre, i.e. the crossing of the dramatic conflict topos with the characteristic lament at the end of the narrative sequence. The topos of transcendence, in which the mediation of non-figure dramatic time by configured narrative time is secured by the stabilization of matter, the continuity of musical flow, and in terms of meaning by Chacon, with its dance-like character, therefore by the pastoral ambience due to which the tragic outcome is overcome. The duality and the refiguration of meaning, i.e. the resemiotization of death and loss by the transcendence, is more impressive if the chaconne is placed now expectedly on an ostinato descending tetrachord, but this time in a major key. So the Phrygian tetrachord is replaced by the major one. This is also a representative example of expressive doubling using Lawrence Kramer's concept. Only the topos of transcendence we will hear. The fairy logistia. Just to shorten my presentation, I will only mention the topos of transcendence in Rameau's opera Hippolyte and Eurydice at the end of its fourth act in the great monologue, tragic monologue of Phaedra. This topos comes after the Phaedra's topos of death and madness. In fact, a great metaphor with the nature change in a horrible nature, from the beautiful to the horrible nature. And then this is topos of transcendence, where we can see the entire matrix of these topos from previous examples from Monteverdi and Lilly, but here reinforced by the force of course, a Rameauian individual style. So general stages of chords, of pedals, of immobilization. So it is the immobility, complete immobility, like frozen movement. Adorno speaks about Mahler, his frozen spaces. This exists in Rameau's topos of transcendence, and it recurs all the time at this topos, in fact, the isotopy of Rameau's work. This is a stability, but with very active dissonances, in fact, which reflect the duality of always the duality between the tension, dramatic tension, tragic tension, and the transcendence calm. It can be analyzed further, but I do not do this at this moment. I would just like to make you hear this transcendent topos in Hippolyte. There is also duality major minor with this very effective modulation you saw from G minor, which is fundamental and fedrus like tonality, to the C major, reflecting the same duality we saw in previous examples. So to conclude, in the monologue, Solitary Life of the Soul, Husserl in his Logische Untersuchungen found a phenomenological situation in which expression would no longer be indicative, and where expression, because it remains interior, was a pure intention without alteration. Derrida criticized the logic of it in the La Grammatologie by showing that all affection marks the eruption of the other, even if it is me in me, as Derrida says, the communication and therefore a distancing of the subject from himself. This is because the soliloquy in music drama shows in a representative way the semiotic function of transcendence in the trajectory of the existential subject sign as disposed in the, as we know all very well, in the existential semiotics by Tarasti, referring to the concept of transcendence of Emmanuel Levinas that I will not discuss here. As the outcome of the journey of an existential subject, the transcendence always presents itself as beyond the affirmation and the negation, as, quote, absolute negation and absolute affirmation, Tarasti, so beyond the otherness and the sameness, the lost time and the time found, incorporating them both in a new temporal and narrative configuration. This is why there is always and necessarily the duality in it, but which reflects the essentially creative, dynamizing musical character of transcendence, leading to the new semantic pertinence of to the creation of the new sign and Dasein. Music operates the transcendence in the drama as the mimesis of the life itself. And this is also why the verbal text, even the poetic text, calls upon the music to effect the convincing representation of the transcendence. In a historical hermeneutics of music and relations of music and verbal text, it is the drama per musica and the tragédie en musique of the 17th and 18th century, which provided the model for the mimetic, for the musical effectuation of transcendence, model subjected then to numerous transfers to other mediums, domains, semantic fields, and musical genres, but always retaining the same path of the existential sign and the ethical path of the tragic subject. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. Today we just have 2 sessions here, so I propose that if there's someone that has to leave, you can ask now, and then we will go on with the next presentation. Okay, and then after the 2 presentations, we can still do some dialogue between 2 papers, okay? So if you want to ask, we have time for 1 or 2 questions now.
So we are discussing.
Yeah,
Thank you, Robert.
Just, so impressed to see how this trope of the merging of the tragic and the overcoming of the tragic happens so early in music drama.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating. And my question is, as your understanding of how it's portrayed, does the subject experience it or will it to happen, or is it given to the subject?
Oh, this is a great question. I'm not sure that I know the answer.
Or it may be ambiguous at that time.
Yes, that's ambiguous. I think that all of that at the same time, you know, because the subject in music drama is subjected to transcendence instances. So, like in Greek tragedy, he is the object, in fact, governed by transcendences, and we must take in our mind that the gods in music drama are present at the sea. They are not present in the Greek tragedy, of course. They are in the transcendent level somewhere, but not at the scene. And this fact that the gods are on the scene was always interpreted from the spectacle effects that music drama wanted to produce, the big spectacle. And that's because in France, Lully and Quinault were accused of making an heresy to the antique model. But in fact, the presence of gods of transcendence make a completely another interpretation, in fact, of antique tragic model in its musical reinterpretation. Because if the transcendence, if the God is here, what does it mean in relation to his relationship with man, with the human beings? So this allows many interpretations of that tragic, let's say, tragic part of the subject, and of course, of Christian interpretation of transcendence and the tragic outcome, and the antique pagan interpretation on the other. So there is that duality, I think, of Christian, the strong, we know Christian influence at that time at the 17th century, confronted with this antique model who paradoxically but counts on the salvation. And that's because Gerhard Nebel and after him, Henri Gouillet, for example, in France, spoke about, in their studies about tragedy, spoke about that tragic fate, the tragic religiosity, anticipating in the Greek tragedy, in fact, the Christian matrix.
Thank you.
So I think that it is conducted by gods, but he is free at the same time, as Schelling put it in his essay and philosophy of tragic. He is free to choose that slavery to gods. This is a romantic interpretation, in fact. Thank you, Robert.
So now we have Dr. Aurelia Pescarrodona. She's professor of music history, aesthetics, and research methods at the Conservatori Superior de Música del Liceu in Barcelona. And she will talk about the singing body in 18th century Spanish music for stage from a semiotic approach.
Well, I have changed a bit my presentation, but more or less the title, the idea. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for having accepted my proposal. As you can see, I have changed somewhat the content of my speech. but my main intention is to share with you how I understand the singing body and how I have used this concept in my studies on 18th century Spanish musical theater. For me, the singer implies his/her body as emitter of the voice sung, as presence on the stage, as actor playing such and such character, and in general, as creator of meanings. One of my interests as a researcher has been to study how we can examine traces of these singing bodies in music of the past. That is, if they were able to impregnate the words composed for them. For this purpose, the Spanish musical theater of late 18th century is particularly suitable, especially the tonadilla, a type of sung intermezzo extremely popular across Spain during the second half of the 18th century. It consisted of a series of sung numbers, usually with very entertaining plots, drawn from everyday life. Throughout my research, I have been able to observe that all the dramaturgic musical elements of the tonadilla revolve around the body of the singer actors, understood principally in a double and interconnected way, their individual body and the abstract bodies of the different roles they will represent, normally caricatured social stereotypes. In previous essays, I have studied in depth the individual cases of singer actors Miguel Garrido and Lorenza Correa, the soprano, applying the theoretical framework of semiotics of the body as developed by Jacques Fontanille in Soma et Sema, and its existential extension in Eero Tarasti's Zemic model. Both theories have allowed me to analyze the grace between the phenomenal body of the actor and the abstract roles he plays, particularly in Miguel Garrido's case, perhaps the best gracioso comic actor of the period and one of the most important performers of tonadillas. Yes, said very succinctly, Fontanille distinguishes between the flesh as enunciative instance when it is a material principle of resistance impulse, but also when it becomes a position of reference. And likewise, the headquarter of the sensory motor nucleus of the semiotic experience, and the body proper, that is the carrier of identity in construction and in becoming. Both entities together comprise the two faces of the ego, its physical bodily reality and its creative image, constituting of and determined by the discursive activity, or as Fontanille says, the moi, the me, and the soi, the self. But Fontanille differentiates two modes of construction of corporeal identity in soi. On one hand, a construction by repetition, by continuous covering of transitory identities and by similitude, the soi idem. And on the other hand, a construction by maintenance and permanence on the same direction, the soi ipse. Eero Tarasti has broadened this theory within his existential semiotics, passing it through the sieves of Greimas and the logic of Hegel, said very succinctly. In the theory of Tarasti, this relationship between the moi and the soi is articulated in four intertwining levels through the four modalities of being. This proposal of Tarasti helped me, and also the of Fontanille, helped me to understand the dialectic between that which belongs to Miguel Garrido, his most carnal moi, and the diverse degrees of stereotypes and conventionalities that existed until arriving at the incarnation of an abstract or ideal character. In this case, well, you can see that, for example, according to the theoretical framework of Fontanille, we have the, I don't see here, the moi of Garrido is the Garrido's flesh, the bodily presence, his tessitura. Sua idem is Garrido's own identity as a gracioso, created by repetition and similitude, and the sua ipse, Garrido performs other abstract roles. And according to the Zemic model of Tarasti, well, the M1 and S4, the visual impact of his physical body, most primary gestures, onomatopoeias, absolute expression, and so on. M2 and S3, the comic recourses of Garrido's ego, the M3 and S2, Garrido is aware of his charisma on stage and as a comic actor, singer, dancer, and man. And M4 and S1, Garrido performs other roles and the conventional bel canto. That's I have arrived at this to this conclusion after analyzing tonadillas created specifically for him. Well, in this case, my intention is to analyze the creation of identities on stage through the interaction between singing bodies. For this purpose, I have chosen the case of María Antonia Fernández La Caramba, one of the most famous performers of tonadillas. Well, I confess that one of the main problems that I have had preparing this paper has been how to translate this nickname, La Caramba. Do you understand? Caramba is an exclamation. Caramba! This room is so hot. Caramba! For example, this is an exclamation. And in English, well, maybe it exists. Ay, caramba! I don't know. Well, but the meaning is important because it represents the impact. It manifests the impact of the only presence of this singer actress on stage. Certainly, La Caramba became a very notorious singer-actress by herself, but it should be noted that from the very beginning of her career in Madrid in 1776, an important part of her identity on stage was created through the interaction by means of opposition and complementarity with other singing bodies, concretely the singer-actress María Mayor Ordóñez, La Mayorita, and Miguel Garrido again. Well, in her first years in the company of Manuel Martínez in Madrid, as the name is Sobresaliente de Música, before being the graciosa of the company 2 years later. One of her specific duties was to fill the musical roles, among them of the graciosa, that is the first lady, the cantado, the first singing lady, well, the main singer of the company, who at that time had been the singer-actress María Mayor Ordóñez La Mayorita. In fact, some scholars have affirmed that the main purpose of La Caramba was to be the substitute of La Mayorita. However, if we take a look at the pieces composed for them, it was rather impossible because La Mayorita had a very high voice, well trained in Italian singing style. I must remember that the voices in these manuscripts always are in soprano clef. But you can see here that the tessitura of La Mayorita was really high and well trained in bel canto. By contrast, La Caramba's vocality was rather different. In the zarzuelas, normally adaptation of Italian operas, that La Caramba performed during her first years in Madrid, she normally played soubrette roles, which were not demanding vocally, but rather more in terms of acting. And sometimes we see important changes to adapt the role to La Caramba's voice, as happened when she performed the role of Menica of Martín Soler's El tutor burlado. The first aria was transposed, as you can see here, this punto bajo, was transposed down a tone, and in the second aria, this one, the most difficult vocal acrobatics were simplified, removing some notes. And instead of it's much easier. Well, however, inside this register, she had enough flexibility to embellish the melodic lines of seguidillas and other popular airs with a profusion of little ornaments typical of autochthonous singing techniques, as I will show you later. What were the performing specialties of La Caramba? She herself enumerates and demonstrates them in the tonadilla for her presentation to the Madrileña audience at the beginning of the 76 season. When she narrates her answer to the daring proposal of a war, she indicates that she did it con mi sonete, here, con mi sonete, mi canto, mi baile y mi soflama. So through her singing, but also her dance and fire, her charisma. Yeah. These elements became crucial for her as a performer to the point of creating her own character, la caramba, mostly identified with Spanish dances, the role of maja, an empowered woman from the lower classes, very proud of her origins, and by extension, a symbol of Spanish authenticity. With such appeal that she even inspired new fashions amongst her public, becoming a genuine influencer. De Tonadilla, el majo y la italiana fingida, this one, by La Serna, Playa de Ferrido, but before our eyes, the transformation of La Caramba from a fake Italian girl to a maja, her real mask. Singing and dancing seguidillas majas, where she displays her most outstanding skills, which were well known and were expected if one attended her shows. Well, here we have the number in which she represents the Italian girl, and it's like an area more or less. I try to sing it more or less like that. Felice quel capone non senti nel suo petto che non avrà paura di perdere sul segno, etc. Well, that's Italian girl, the fake Italian girl. And this is the seguidillas maja here. The seguidillas maja. And that's sound more or less like that. Aunque la aire de maja, aunque la aire de maja, no le tenemos, también hay italianas con resalero. Mira usted, qué relajo, mira usted, qué graciajo, mira usted, qué columpio, mira usted, qué poleo, mira usted, qué poleo, vaya usted a la toma, ¿dónde está fermo? More or less, that's the performance and approach to this seguidillas majas. And I have highlighted this part because here the text is saying, mire usted que, look at my gesture, look at my gesture, look how I'm moving, look how I'm dancing. He's focusing the attention to her body, to her performance, and how he is dancing and moving and doing this performance. Well, and the body, of course. However, the gestural corporality of La Caramba on stage was not exclusively aimed at showcasing her machismo. She exploits her corporality. Is this, no, it's this one. Yes, oh, yes. She exploits her corporality in many gestural gags in a very funny way. An excellent example is Los Murmuradores by Pablo Esteva, where La Caramba sings and dances a fandango, showing immense pride of her talent. But she has to stop suddenly due to a dancing accident. Well, I have here the transcription, because it is very interesting to see how the orchestra is doing. Well, it is more or less like that. Yes. That's the begins the fandango. Que a mí no me importa nada, que por más que me diga, siempre de ser la caramba, siempre de ser la caramba, ole, 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 ole. And the orchestra is playing, the fandango is continuing to play the fandango, and she, deténgase usted que me duele este pie. Stop, I have a pain in my foot. Well, here the dancing identity of La Caramba is eclipsed by her gestural comicity, making a caricature of herself. He also uses the voice as a comical device. For example, in the last number of this same tonadilla, a seguidilla where La Caramba plays a peasant who takes care of her turkeys, imitating their sounds and gestures. Here, for example, do you see? Here is She does something like she's imitating the turkey with the voice, with onomatopoeias. Yes. Honestly, I don't imagine La Majorita incarnating a turkey on stage. Therefore, we are before two opposite ways of understanding the singing body. One aerial and vocal, and the other more corporeal. One which moves and dances and exploits consciously the power of the body on stage, where the voice is more the means and not the end. According to the theoretical framework mentioned previously, La Majorita's singing body is based on a very trained moi, her natural high voice, that becomes a sua ipse, a construction of vocal skills in relation to external criteria. Therefore, it is an M1 linked to a S1. On the contrary, La Caramba's identity on stage is located in her sua idem, created by repetition and similitude, playing with her comical gestures in her M2S3, but creating her own mask as a performer in the zone of M3S2, La Caramba, a mask which identifies her as a performer and tinges all her interpretations. The main difference between both is clear. All well-trained voice with La Majorita's tessitura can sing her pieces, but the pieces for La Caramba need a new caramba. So, if La Caramba could substitute for La Majorita, what was her initial function in Martinez's company? We find the answer in another of the pieces performed at the beginning of the 76th season. In this piece, Miguel Garrido complains that the current graciosa de música, that is, La Majorita, is so serious and exquisite that she ruins his performance when she gargles. The director of the company, Manuel Martinez, answers him saying, understood, because here is the one who can be a good partner for you, referring to La Caramba. Therefore, the initial purpose of La Caramba was to be the more suitable companion of the main comic actor of the company, as indeed she was in many great tonadillas. How does this partnership work? In two ways, by contrast and by complementarity. The contrast was essentially visual. As usual in Graciosos, Garrido was short and fat, and La Caramba was tall, thin, and good-looking. Therefore, La Caramba corresponded to what was female canonical beauty during that period, and Garrido could be found at the antipodes of beauty ideals. This visual contrast would have constituted a comic resource by itself. However, the tonadillas made for them are based essentially on the great rapport between them on stage through a display of wit, gestural humor, gags, and much dance. In fact, both performers had similar configurations in the M2S3 zones. This understanding encouraged the performing skills of La Caramba and Garrido, as did the gifted composers of the tonadillas on a musical level, especially Pablo Esteve, who knew how to exploit their talents through the music he composed. An excellent example is La desdicha de las tonadillas by Esteve, where both perform a paso heroico, as heroic scene, as a hilarious parody of serious genres, which finishes with where vocalizations, here is and a cadence emitted a gritos, shouting. Here, the caricature of operatic style is taken to its extreme with an M2 that evolves towards the most carnal M1, a shout that violently invades the operatic S1. This understanding of La Caramba and Garrido allowed for the introduction of some popular songs and dance, such as fandangos, piranas, and so on. However, sometimes Garrido's performance is deliberately more comical than La Caramba's. For example, in La Avenida de María Antonia, Garrido laments the absence of his partner, trágico a su modo, is tragically in his way. And afterwards, both bailan here. Bailan un minuet corto y Garrido lo baila bufo. Dance a short minuet and Garrido dances it comically. Both created a role based on their own personality and performing skills. The trois idem of Fontanet, found in the M3S2 zone in the semic theory, but Garrido's is more grotesque, probably related to his physical appearance, M1, the Ciceronian turpitudo et deformitas. In this regard, Esteba's tonadilla, Garrido de luto por la caramba, is particularly noteworthy. Garrido misses his seemingly deceased, but still alive, late partner, and remembers how she sang and danced, imitating her here, remeda lo que quiere de la caramba, he imitates la caramba, dancing and singing, whatever. And here, another thing, twice. This overlapping of bodily identities, the grotesque Garrido dancing and singing like, the grotesque Garrido dancing and singing like his slender and skilled partner surely was an excellent comical recourse. Therefore, after this analysis, we can situate La Caramba's on-stage identity in relation to La Mayorita and Garrido inside this semiotic square. The names of the vertex excellently represent extremes inside the typologies of singer actors in these companies, according to two criteria fundamental in this context: gender, men or women, and performing skills. On one hand, there is the universe of the proper graciosos, with a very global role of the body on stage. And on the other hand, we find more serious singer actors, also excellent performers, but more based on well-trained singing skills. In fact, I have added here this vertex with the name of the celebrated Manuel Garcia. We should not forget that Manuel Garcia began his career singing this repertoire a bit later. Well, it should be noted that we are talking only about the most representative name of each typology. In this context, we can find also a very interesting gamut of grease between these vertex, with a very rich crossover mixture of styles, techniques, etc., always departing from the peculiarities of each individual singing body. I hope that the proposed theoretical framework will help to analyze this complex and at the same time fascinating topic, and also to give tools to the performers to better understand this repertoire from the body, empathizing with these bodies of the past from our own bodily individuality, our moi, to produce an interpretation understood from a bodily dialectic. And thank you for your attention.
For this interesting paper, Spanish music. There's any question? Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your most interesting presentation and beautiful performance. So
thank you. with this hot, yes. Thank you.
Well, in fact, I have a pair of questions. The first of those would be, do you think that the characters like Miguel Garrido or overall La Caramba were just continuing the tradition of Spanish Golden Age theater graciosos?
Yes.
Or they were really starting a new vogue that later would bloom at the end of the 19th century with General Chico theater?
Yes, yes, that is very interesting because I think that there is a continuity, an adaptation. Well, these graciosos come from the tradition of the Golden Age. That's clear. But here we have a new genre, the tonadilla. The tonadilla is very peculiar and it's like, as you have seen, it's like mini operas. And this peculiar, thanks to this peculiar pieces, the graciosas became the most important singers of the company. This is the case of La Caramba or La Mayorita, and etc. So I think that it's a continuation that that afterwards follows that will continue to arrive to this to the zarzuelas, as you have said, the zarzuelas in the 19th century and so on. In fact, I have found that in these zarzuelas of 18th century that La Garamba performed, she was the pair of Garrido. Garrido was a tenor, and she was a tiple, a sobre. So I think that they were maybe the antecedent of the comic pair in the zarzuela, in the posterior zarzuelas. The comic pair, the comic tenor and a comic soprano. Yeah, I think that there is a continuation in this kind of singer actors. Yes.
Sorry, the other question is,
yes.
Have you documented if La Caramba was really a good trained dancer, or her success relied mainly of her graceful charisma on stage?
Both things. Well, she was an excellent dancer. Yes, that she was an excellent dancer. I don't know if she had a master, a singing master. Yes, I have found this information. The dancing master, I don't know, but she was an excellent dancer. That's true. For example, there is a tonadilla, I don't remember the title, in which she dances a zapateado. The zapateado is a Spanish dance. It's very difficult to dance because it's, you need to be just specialized in this kind of Spanish dance. The zapateado is very, very difficult to dance. And also, I have forgotten to say it, and it's very interesting. She was able to sing, dance, and playing the castanets simultaneously. Yes, she was a very well-trained dancer. And also, she has a brilliant charisma, as I have said. Both. Caramba! Yes, that's the reaction of the audience.
Well, so if there's not any more questions, I think it's time to close the session. So thank you both for your brilliant papers.
Thank you very much.